So out of all of the big retro throwback first-person action games and first-person shooters and such, Graven was pretty near the top of my list for games that I was most interested in because of its setting and premise. It wasn't just another retro throwback FPS. It was set in a sort of dark medieval fantasy world, and it was styled more after the likes of HeXen than anything else. And HeXen, in case you haven't played it, is a very weird game as far as retro FPSs, or first-person action games, I guess is really the better way to describe that one, go. Because it came out in an era dominated by what we back then referred to as Doom clones, where they basically played like Doom. You went from level to level, you had multiple episodes, and it was all in a very linear progression, and it worked really well and continues to work really well. But HeXen was different because its level structure was designed around hubs. So you would go into a level and it would put you in a hub, and there would be several different offshoots of that hub that you would need to go to in order to solve puzzles, get keys to progress, and things like that. And while admittedly it could be very confusing because it was one of the very first attempts at that sort of thing in a first-person game, it actually ended up working out mostly okay, and the sequel took what that did and improved upon it. But of course, while I will eventually be making a video on HeXen 2, along with its Portal of Pravis expansion, the main thing you need to know for this particular video is that those are the biggest inspirations behind Graven, HeXen 1 and HeXen 2. But of course it goes beyond simply being heavily inspired by HeXen 1 and 2. They also implemented kind of a grab bag of features from a variety of games. It has inventory management, side quests, and weapon upgrades like you would see in the likes of, say, more recent Deus Ex games or something along those lines, as well as a death and save system that was probably inspired by Souls-likes, although it doesn't quite go as far as they do. And a bit of Metroidvania influence in the sense that you can go back to previous areas that you had already explored once you find various items and abilities later on in the game, and then be able to access areas that you couldn't access before. And there's even some environmental reactivity, things like being able to cast your lightning spell at a pool of water and electrocute anything that is standing in that pool of water. These are all certainly interesting ideas, although they do contribute to the game not really feeling all that retro. But that's not necessarily a problem. A lot of games use retro aesthetics and have retro inspirations, but don't necessarily feel retro and can do just fine. And as a bonus, it features the voice talents of Stephen Waite, the voice of Caleb in the classic first-person shooter Blood. Thus, back when Graven was initially revealed to the public and initially went into early access, I was very curious to see how it turned out. And it took the developers, Slipgate Ironworks, along with their publishers, 3D Realms and Fulcrum Publishing, almost 3 years since the game was initially launched into early access to get the game to a full 1.0 release. So, what exactly are we dealing with now that the game's been out for a few months and it's even had a few patches to fix up some of the technical issues that the game launched with? Well, the title of the video probably clued you in onto what we have here, but it's a rather bewildering mess. Because rather than feeling like a cohesive, coherent game, Graven feels like a collection of ideas that are either not fleshed out enough, or just hamstrung by technical problems, or, much more commonly, incredibly poor design choices. For example, the game is clearly inspired by retro first-person shooters and first-person action games. And yet it does not have a manual save system. It only has checkpoint saves, or the option to just save and quit, which if you take it, will not allow you to just pick up where you left off at the last checkpoint. Instead, it starts you back at the hub. So anything that you were doing, no matter where you went, you have to go from where you spawn in the hub, which in Act 1 is going to be the middle of the town of Cruxforth, all the way back to wherever it was you previously were, fighting through all of the same enemies you had previously fought through. The only exceptions there are boss fights and mini-bosses. Those don't respawn, but all of the skeletons and flying bat things that spit acid at you, the zombies, cultists, swamp monsters, whatever it may well be that you were fighting through that were just normal enemies, those all respawn, so you have to fight your way through all of them again. And while basic health, ammo, and mana pickups will respawn, Items that stay in your inventory, like healing potions and such, don't respawn, so if you were using all of your healing potions and you're, say, down to 1, well, your only options there are to either go to the shop and buy some, or just hope you run across more of them later on, because the ones you've already found are not going to respawn, so you can't just go back to some place you previously were and pick up more health potions in the same spot you found them previously. Now that in itself is really annoying. It's annoying to be forced to backtrack constantly to begin with, but being forced to backtrack and having it be a constant drain on your resources for doing so makes it considerably more irritating. Now, best case scenario is that it's only a drain on your ammunition. You're not letting enemies get close enough to hit you, and you're able to get out of the way of any kind of ranged attacks. And while that's going to still be annoying, at least the ammo pickups in the game are pretty plentiful, so you're never really going to need to worry about that. The thing is, it's rarely going to be a best case scenario, because even if you're keeping enemies at a distance, you're still going to get hit by something. Getting out of the way of attacks is remarkably difficult, and not in a good way. In most combat encounters, you're going to be going up against both ranged and melee enemies. And in addition to ranged enemies often throwing multiple projectiles at you at once, making it considerably more difficult to actually get out of the way of the incoming attack, there's also the fact that melee attacks are a complete crapshoot. You don't have any sort of quick dash maneuvers or anything like that, so you have to rely on either simply getting out of the way of the attack by running, walking, or jumping, or you have to rely on blocking with your sword. And I completely gave up on even attempting to block with the sword because the damage frames of enemy attack animations made absolutely no sense. Sometimes they're where you would kind of expect them to be in the animation phase, but other times they're in the wind-up phase of the attack animation, so the enemy will go to attack you, and before it even looks like their weapon is coming at you, they've already hit you for a large amount of damage. So at least as far as the melee enemies go, really the only thing you can do to actually avoid getting hit by them is simply to be as far away from them as you possibly can and take them down before they get close enough to hit you. But you also have to keep in mind that you're also being attacked by ranged enemies, some of which have damage over time effects, and some of which have splash damage. So even if you are avoiding the direct hits from the projectiles or avoiding the melee enemies, you are still going to get hit at some point, and it's going to do a remarkably high amount of damage to you. And since the amount of damage the enemies do to you is so high, and the instant use healing items that you find that are actually respawning throughout the world are only going to give you 5 hit points per pickup, you're probably going to be relying on healing potions, which don't respawn, and you need to either buy at the shop or find only once in a given location somewhere in the world. And not only do those heal you over time instead of just giving you a big blob of health all at once, they require you to switch to that item, use that item, and then switch back to whatever weapon you were previously using, so they actively interrupt your ability to combat the enemies that are actively doing damage to you. This, of course, increases the gradual frustration you're going to have with the gameplay loop, and the only real saving grace is that the enemies tend to be really stupid, so you can kind of lure them into coming at you and just dealing with them one at a time, or you can get them stuck on things in the environment and then cheese them to death. But since you don't always know when you're going to have access to an ammo pickup, you're probably going to try to conserve your ammunition as much as possible for the times where you really do need it. And in addition to the crapshoot and melee damage effect, the melee system just doesn't seem to work properly. I mean, to give you some examples, I upgraded the staff and the sword to the extent that I could upgrade them up to the point I was playing at the time. And the information from the upgrades told me that I would be doing more damage. And in the case of the sword, if the sword was bloody, if I had hit an enemy that actually bleeds and then covered the sword in blood, then the swing range, speed, and damage of the sword are increased, but frankly, I couldn't even tell the difference. It seemed to swing exactly the same speed, have exactly the same range, and do exactly the same rather limited amount of damage. Same exact kind of thing with the staff upgrades. It acts like it'll do more damage, but it doesn't seem to actually do any more damage. And because the game does an absolutely terrible job of of conveying information to the player. I'm not sure if this is intentional, if it's just very, very slight upgrades, or if it's bugged, or if I'm just doing something wrong. Although I'm pretty sure I'm not really doing anything wrong with regards to the melee attacks. I mean, sure, there's critical hit locations on all the enemies that you can aim for that will do extra damage, but that doesn't seem to work all the time with melee either. I mean, for enemies where their weak spot is their head, I've aimed at their head, hit them in the head, and it doesn't seem to do any more damage than if I were to hit them in, say, their leg. But the thing is, I know that at least sometimes that critical hit location works, because I've also hit enemies in the head with melee attacks, and it's taken them out in a single hit before, but there's absolutely no consistency to this whatsoever. Thus, my prevailing thought is that the melee combat in general is just really glitchy. As a result, you're going to rely primarily on ranged combat to see through the whole game, and we'll come back to that. But the point here is that in order to get back to where you were in the first place, instead of just loading into the game, you have to fight your way through a bunch of enemies with really weird, inconsistent, likely glitched melee combat, and an obnoxious drain on your resources. But as if that weren't enough, the game has absolutely no built-in map feature whatsoever. No auto map, no journal type map, no world map, absolutely nothing. You have to rely entirely on either drawing a map yourself, using an external guide, or just hoping your memory is good enough to figure out where you were going in the first place and what you might have missed. And while I've seen some people misconstrue this as trying to make the game even more retro, I need to remind you that auto maps have been a feature that was standard in first-person action games going back to the very early 90s. I mean, hell, even those primary influences I mentioned, HeXen 1 and 2, both had auto map features. Now sure, it didn't exactly help you all that much, especially in the original HeXen, but it was still present, and it was still something to help you navigate the environments with. Graven has nothing, and from what I've seen from Steam discussions and such, it doesn't seem like this was a result of any kind of attempt at making the game more retro, but rather, the programmers ran into some weird issue with making it work, and so they decided to just scrap the feature entirely in favor of working on other things, which apparently included things like cross-platform multiplayer, which as far as I'm aware doesn't actually work, although good luck finding people to play multiplayer with this game anyway, as well as dynamic water freezing and melting, spell improvements, we'll get to that, character lighting improvements, and puzzle fixes. You know what they should have put that time into? Ironing out the severe game-breaking glitches that persist to this day that can actually lock you out of finishing the game entirely. And I mean, come on, you couldn't just have somebody draw up a quick map to say where the different regions were, at least, so that you could actually understand where it is you were trying to get to, instead of just having to rely on your memory, or just wandering around aimlessly until eventually the game pops up on screen with the location you're actually trying to get to. And if you wanted to stick to something that was kind of diegetic, you could at least put it in the journal, just have a quick drawing that the priest himself has made to say, hey, this is where this area is, and this is where it is in relation to other stuff. Just have arrows pointing to where different things are, or something along those lines. Anything would be better than nothing. And if you still utterly refuse to provide any kind of map feature after that, then at the very least, make sure the directions that you're given for where you need to go and what you need to do are much better presented to the player, because this game has a really nasty habit of just giving you a message that says journal updated, and then you have to go digging around in your journal entries to figure out what it was that was updated, and you have to scroll down through things that you've already read through to find the new stuff, and the new stuff that's added just says something like, I have found a key, now it is time to move on to such and such location, only you don't know where this new location is because there's no indication of where that new location is supposed to be until you've wandered around the environment for a while and found the new area that you haven't been to yet that is unlocked now. I understand what they were trying to go for here. They were trying to go for a game that is a bit more cerebral, where you have to look around the environments themselves, explore, find secrets, read journal entries and books and notes and things like that, to piece together where you are, what you're trying to do, and how to solve puzzles and things like that. I get what they were trying to do. The problem is that the execution thereof was so poorly thrown together that it makes it seem like the developers had absolutely no idea what they were friggin' doing. To give you a prime example of that, relatively early on in the game, you will come across a large pillar that you have to rotate using a series of levers in order to get the 3 sections of the pillar to line up with a specific solution, and that will unlock it and allow you to get a key. Alright, cool, puzzle solving. How do we solve this puzzle? Well, you find a note next to the pillar that gives you a small part of the solution that's nowhere near enough to solve the puzzle on its own. You need to find additional notes scattered around the area that, when you combine the information given in those notes, will ultimately lead you to the solution of the puzzle. Perfectly reasonable setup, which I picked up on immediately, so I started scouring the area for the other notes that would lead me to the solution of the puzzle. And I never found them. I spent what had to have been about an hour just wandering around every single area I could access, scouring every surface, every wall, every floor, every breakable object, every single thing that I could think of. I was looking for these various bits of the solution of the puzzle, and I could not find them. I even found some secret areas that I hadn't found before, and yet I still could not figure out where the hell the bits of this solution to this puzzle were. So I just said, you know what, screw it. I looked up the solution online, input said solution, picked up the key, fought the enemies that spawned in, because of course enemies spawned in after that, and then spent the next 10 or so minutes wandering around trying to find the door that key went to, because I forgot where it was. If the game had some sort of even very primitive map feature that would just give you general locations of things, or if it had better directions in the journal, or if the environments had better signposting to direct you in the ways you're supposed to go, instead of just being large environments that you're meant to just wander around aimlessly in until you figure out where the hell you're supposed to go, then this whole situation probably would not have happened. I probably would have found the various notes that clued me into the solution, pieced them together, and then put that solution in. Instead, because there wasn't really any way of keeping track of where I had been and what was a new area, I ended up wandering around areas I'd already been in multiple times until I eventually found something that was unique enough for that particular area that I realized, oh, I've already been here. Wait a minute, where the hell is the new area? And then just continued this process over and over and over again until eventually I just said, screw it, let's look up the solution online so I can just stop running around in circles and actually make some damn progress for a change. It's the kind of thing that any reasonable developer would release to a test group of some sort. That test group would give them the feedback saying, look, navigating these environments is a real pain in the ass, and then the developers would take that feedback and then implement changes to the game to not necessarily make it less difficult, but at least make navigating much less of a frustrating chore. But apparently, given the experience I had with Graven, Slipgate Ironworks is not a reasonable developer, so we ended up with what we ended up with, and it makes you wonder if they did any playtesting on the game at all, or even paid any attention to the feedback they were getting during early access. Because you would think if they were paying attention to the feedback they were getting, that a lot of the game's issues would have been fixed. Not just the technical problems, and not just the lack of a map and the poor signposting, but also things like the way the combat feels. I've already talked about the melee, but even ranged combat in this game is just a mess. I mean, the game starts you out and you have a staff, and then pretty soon after that you're going to get an ignite spell, which is a flame spell. You think, oh cool, you can set enemies on fire, you might be able to use a flamethrower effect or launch fireballs and things. No, you just set things on fire and then it very, very slowly does damage over time. At that stage in the game, you are quite literally better off just whacking things with your staff, because the flame spell does so little damage to the enemies you're fighting that it's just completely worthless to use in combat. Not too long after that, you'll get access to a lightning spell, and that will stun enemies when you zap them with it, but the stun lasts for such a short period of time that it really doesn't leave the enemies vulnerable long enough for you to be able to capitalize on it, and like with the flame spell, it does basically no damage at all, so it's effectively useless as an actual combat spell. Again, you can stun enemies, and you would think that would lead to, say, the 1-2 combo like you have in Bioshock, where you zap them with the plasmid and then you bash them in the face with the wrench. But nope, that's not how Graven works. You can shock them, you can zap them, you can even zap enemies that are in pools of water, and it will shock all of the enemies in that pool of water and stun them very briefly. But that's basically all it does. And then later on, you get access to an ice spell that will allow you to freeze the water in the environment so you can walk on it. But if you use it on enemies, then it just slows them down. And while sure, you can eventually upgrade the spells to be more effective in combat, it's not actually worth doing so because the gold cost is really high, and that would be just much better spent on upgrading your actual weapons. And you also need to have quills, which are a very rare item in the game that you only get a few of, so actually being able to upgrade the spells is really not practical. Thus, the spells almost immediately get relegated to nothing more than puzzle solving. You use the flame spell to burn away spiderwebs that slow you down, as well as wooden things that you can't just knock down by bashing them. You use the lightning spell to power up machinery to open gates and things like that. And then you use the ice spell to either freeze water so you can walk on it, or to freeze those powered-up machines that you've just shocked into life, so that whatever change they made to the environment actually stays instead of being reset. And while don't get me wrong, I definitely appreciate the puzzle-solving aspects of the game, when you get spells like that, you get the promise of wanting to use those spells on your enemies and turn into a powerful mage, and you just don't get that in Graven. And even if you try to use those spells to supplement your other weapons, you're better off just using whatever ranged weapons you have ammunition for and just blasting the crap out of enemies with them. And even that gets frustrating because of the way they've set up the inventory management system and how you come across the various weapons. You see, early on in the game, you get access to the cuff arrow. It's your first basic ranged weapon, and it's a wrist-mounted mini crossbow. Obviously it does barely any damage, but it is your first ranged weapon, and it's useful for taking out especially those flying enemies that spit acid at you. But considering the layout of the game's environments, the lack of a map, and the lack of any kind of decent signposting, it took me nearly an hour to find the next weapon. And that was the flechette launcher, which is another type of crossbow that says it launches barbs at things, but they're actually just a bunch of rocks. And it basically serves as the game's shotgun. Not long after that, I found the short sword. Now, I think the developers intended for you to find the short sword before you find the flechette launcher, but because when I was presented with a forked pathway that went off to the left and right, I chose the left path, I ended up finding the flechette launcher first, and then the short sword after that. It then took me around 3 hours to find the next weapon, and it was hidden in a secret area. Said weapon is the orthogonal hymnal, which is apparently a cursed heretical book that is basically the game's equivalent of the Necronomicon, and whenever you hold it out, it basically shrieks horrible things at enemies and does damage to them. It's got rather short range, and it's not a lot of damage that it does, but hey, it's a use for all of that mana that you've been hoarding because the game doesn't give you much of a reason to use spells except for puzzle-solving implements. Now, the entire time you're going about all of this, the game is giving you ammunition for a weapon called the peat burner, but you don't know where that is. And you can't access it until you're a good several hours into the game and have gotten the resonance stone, which is one of the crystals you can slot into your staff in order to give it some magical effects. It allows you to break through surfaces that have a bunch of cracking on them, and which you would think you would be able to blast through by putting a bunch of explosive barrels next to them and setting those alight, but no, you have to use the resonance stone. The thing is, this means that the peat launcher, which you have been getting tons of ammo for all the way up to this point, is hidden away in a secret area. So you can't access it for several hours, and it's something that would be very useful because it's the game's equivalent of a grenade or rocket launcher. So, not only do you have to spend a couple of hours progressing in the main plot to get to the Resonance Stone so you can actually get to this thing, but then you have to do even more backtracking through areas you've already been through to find the one wall you need to break down with the Resonance Stone in order to get access to the secret area that has the peat burner in it. And, of course, the peat burner is well worth using. It's a very effective weapon. But it's also the kind of weapon that you would look at in a retro shooter context and think, that is kind of a staple weapon. Why is it hidden in a secret area that takes you several hours into the game to access? Especially considering that you're finding ammo for this thing before you even gain access to any other weapons than the staff, the flame spell, and the cuff arrow. You also find a bunch of ammunition called stakes, which you find out much later on is for a weapon called the ballista, which is basically just a regular-sized crossbow that actually does a fair amount of damage and can pin enemies to walls. But the pacing for all of this is just really weird. Why are you getting ammunition for all of these things before you even can access the area that those weapons are actually located in? It's not like you can build up a bunch of gold and then go to the blacksmith or the alchemist and buy those weapons. It's not like you can access them early in secret areas. You have to specifically progress through the storyline to get either the item that you need to get to that secret area, or just find the area that the weapon is in. The ballista, for example, is just sitting in the open in the bog area, and yet you're finding ammunition for it basically at the same time you're finding ammunition for the peat burner, and so you're just left wondering, okay, well, what's all this ammo for, and why am I finding this before I find the weapons that they go to? Obviously, I understand with the idea of you being able to backtrack between areas that they would want to have ammunition spawning in the various crates and barrels and stuff so that you can actually keep those weapons topped up. But it's really weird going through areas and having ammo completely topped up for weapons you just don't even have and still finding tons of ammo for them long before you find the weapons themselves. You never really had to worry about that in games like, say, Doom or Quake or Heretic or HeXen or anything like that, because either the weapons used a more universal ammunition, like in HeXen with the weapons using mana, or the level designers wouldn't start putting ammunition for those weapons into the levels until they knew you at least had a chance of finding it in, say, a secret area in an earlier level. And fun fact, for those of you who may not necessarily have played a lot of old-school first-person shooters, that's always a clue to you. If you start finding ammunition for a weapon and you don't have that weapon yet, that means that either that weapon was located in a secret area earlier on in the game than you currently are, or it's located in the level you currently are in. I guess you could say that technically Graven is doing the same kind of thing, but the way the levels are structured and the way you have a hub world that you're going back and forth between, it definitely doesn't feel the same and actually can get a bit irritating. Especially if you're stuck with, say, one or two weapons like I was for several hours and are getting increasingly frustrated by finding all these ammo pickups for weapons you just can't access yet, all the while running low on ammunition for the weapons you do have. As a result of all of this, the weapon progression in Graven is just frustrating and confusing, and when you realize that a bunch of the weapons are just different variants of crossbow, it actually gets kind of boring as well. I mean, sure, the weapons can certainly be quite effective, especially once you've upgraded them. For example, the flechette launcher becomes pretty much overpowered once you give it the upgrade that launches explosive barbs as the secondary fire, because not only will that secondary fire just absolutely shred through most enemies in very short order, but ammo for it is plentiful, so even if the spread on the shots means that you don't actually hit anything with it, you can actually afford to miss shots with it simply because ammo for it is going to be right around the corner anyway. But in order to get those upgrades, you need to pay a large amount of gold, so you're going to be wandering around the levels, scouring them for every last bit of gold you can find, because you're going to put that into weapon and spell upgrades, which of course feeds into the cycle of backtracking as you're constantly looking for secret areas that might have stashes of gold in them. But then there's the inventory management, which I was utterly baffled by. I legitimately have no idea why the developers of Graven even put it into the game in the first place, because all of the quest items you find have dedicated quest item slots that don't interfere with anything else in your inventory, and despite there being a grid-based inventory and different items taking up different numbers of slots, there seems to be plenty of room in your inventory for everything you would want to carry anyway. And only important things you pick up will be added to this inventory, so weapons, potions, and that's it, actually, just weapons and potions. And as you collect your various weapons and potions, you find that potions take up a single slot and you can have a stack of up to 9 of them of any given type, but you can only carry 1 stack of them at a time. So if, for example, you find some healing potions, once you have 9 of those, you can no longer pick up any more healing potions until you use one of them. That seems like an odd choice if you're going to go with an inventory management system. You would think that if they're going to implement something like that, then maybe you have stacks of 9 potions, but then you can have multiple stacks of them. But nope, that's not how Graven does it. You get a single stack of potions per potion type, and that stack can have up to 9 potions, and you cannot carry any more than that. Okay, so that's definitely weird, but what about the rest of the inventory management? Well, you have to shift your various weapons around, and each of those takes up a different number of slots. For example, the cuff arrow only takes up a single slot, then other weapons like the short sword and the orthogonal hymnal take up 2 slots, and then other weapons like, say, the flechette launcher or the peat burner take up 3 slots. So now you're thinking, okay, well, your inventory management would be juggling the various weapons themselves and the ammunition in such a way to where you're maximizing the space within your inventory. But nope, the only things that are placed in the grid section of the inventory are your weapons and your potions. And they are incredibly simplistic to organize, and you cannot rotate any of these things. So everything is only horizontal numbers of slots. So it is ridiculously simple to organize. So why bother with this system anyway when you're going to be able to organize everything and carry everything anyway? Well, what the developers decided to do with this is have your hotbar affected by the number of slots the items that you're putting into it take up. So, for example, when you put a potion into your hotbar, it takes up a single slot. When you put the short sword into your hotbar, it takes up 2 slots, so on and so forth. And since you only have 10 slots in the hotbar, and 2 of them are permanently taken up by the staff and the spellbook, that means that the inventory management is entirely about putting things into your hotbar so you can actually pull them out during combat. So okay, that makes sense. You create tension by having a limited number of hotbar slots for you to have anything active at any given time, meaning that you need to be careful about what you set in your loadout at any given point so that you make sure you have ammunition, as well as any potions you might need in the immediate. I mean, obviously, you're going to have health potions in your hotbar at all times because they're just always useful, but you don't necessarily need the mana potions or the swamp water movement potions at all times, so you're going to swap those in and out as you need them. And that's going to affect which weapons you're going to be able to have in your hotbar at any given time. So obviously what they're going for here is a delicate balancing act. Do you have the hotbar full of really powerful weapons that take up all of the slots? Or do you use some of the weaker weapons that don't take up as many slots, but they allow you to fit more things in it? Some real tactical choices there, except you don't need to make any tactical choices because the game pauses whenever you go into the inventory screen, so you can just go into the inventory screen, swap out whatever weapons you have in your hotbar that don't have any ammunition or that you're trying to conserve ammunition for weapons that you do have plenty of ammunition for, and just continue on like absolutely nothing happened. Meaning that the entire inventory management and hotbar system is completely pointless. But oh, it gets even better. Remember how I said that ammo doesn't appear in the inventory in the various slots? It doesn't appear in the inventory at all. The only time you're going to know how much ammunition you have for any given weapon is when you equip it. There is a ton of empty space on the inventory screen that could very easily be used to show you how much ammunition you have, or even if you select a particular weapon, it should tell you how much ammo you have for it, but it doesn't. Why? Why would you design a system like this? It makes no sense from any way you look at it. You've put in an inventory management system, but rendered it pointless, And you've also not included the amount of ammo you have, but you have included the amount of quills and gold that you have in dedicated slots. You have dedicated ring slots. You have dedicated quest item slots. Why can't you have ammo slots as well? Or, I don't know, just do away with the grid-based inventory management system entirely in favor of something that's actually fucking functional. I guess I shouldn't really be surprised at this, given that the developers removed the map feature that was in the game during early access, because apparently they couldn't make it work with Acts 2 and 3, even though it worked perfectly fine in Act 1. But this is the kind of really basic shit that Graven gets wrong and just utterly drives me up the wall. Developers had this kind of stuff figured out in the early 90s. It is 2024. This game has been in early access for nearly 3 years, and they couldn't even figure out how to get something working that is in Unreal Engine by default. What the hell have they been doing over the past 3 years? I mean, I know that their Embracer layoffs and stuff definitely affected this somehow, but this is the kind of shit that they should have caught early on in the early access period, because I guarantee you that somebody told them about it, and yet they seem to either have been completely incapable of fixing a lot of this stuff, or they just blatantly ignored what people were saying. I mean, I might be able to forgive them if the level design were good and the enemies were fun to fight, but they're not. The level design is a mess, like I've already talked about, and the enemies are all dumber than a sack of bricks. They have a really weird habit of when you hit them, they will just jump to the left or right instantly for no discernible reason. They're definitely not dodging, they just take a hit and then poof, they're a couple of steps away, and it doesn't make any sense. The hitboxes are weird, and especially with the critical hit locations, and the only thing that really makes them a proper threat to the player is the fact that they can take away about 1/3 of your health with a single hit, even if you're playing on the normal difficulty, let alone the harder ones. And even that doesn't really become much of a problem until your stamina runs out, because of course, on top of all this other crap, they had to put a stamina system in the game, so that if you sprint or jump or swing your melee weapons, it drains your stamina, and if your stamina runs out, then you swing your weapons a lot more slowly, and you can no longer sprint, meaning that your ability to get out of the way of incoming damage is curtailed significantly, meaning that you're probably going to start taking a lot of hits. That is going to do a ton of damage to you, it's going to dig into your resources, and if you end up dying, you end up going back to the hub and having to go all the way back to where you were previously, having lost a small amount of gold because that's the only actual penalty for dying in this game. It is just an absolute mess of a game where it seems like the developers really didn't know what they actually wanted to do with it, so they just threw a bunch of ideas into it without fleshing any of them out, and then just proceeded to squander nearly 3 years of early access doing barely anything at all except for removing a feature that was actually kind of vital for the game and just adding in more stuff that doesn't actually seem to go anywhere. And if you're thinking that maybe you can stick through the game and get through Act 1 and Act 2 and beyond will improve things, you are sorely mistaken, because it does not get any better after Act 1. And not even the story can save it, because it barely even has a story. You play as a priest who saved his adoptive daughter from a fellow priest who turned out to be a heretic that was trying to sacrifice her to some eldritch deity or something. And theoretically, the story is that the priest is searching for either news of his daughter or something that will lead him back to her, and along the way, he's having to go through trials and tribulations related to this plague that has infested the land and so on and so forth. But it doesn't go anywhere. You get that initial cutscene, and then for the rest of Act 1, you get absolutely nothing, and then at the end of Act 1, it gives you a transitional cutscene that tells you that now you're going into the frozen lands of the north, seeking answers from a Lord Grimwine, and, well, you're still not really getting anything after that, except for, by the way, now we've got this new area for you to just wander around and do gameplay things in, so the story and storytelling in this game are absolutely pathetic. And one of the most frustrating things about this game is that if you were to cut out every last bit of the absurd amounts of backtracking and getting lost because you don't have a map and things like that, the game would probably be around 6 or so hours long, a perfectly reasonable length for an old-school style first-person shooter or a first-person shooter of any kind. And yet, because of everything I have brought up to this point, In order to get from Act 1 to Act 2, completing all the side quests and finding the major weapons and things like that, it took me nearly 11 hours. Now, some of you might say, oh, well, that means it's great value. There's tons of game there. But no. It was nearly 11 hours of backtracking through the exact same environments over and over again, fighting the same brain-dead enemies over and over again, scouring the environments for any slight change or any bit of evidence telling me exactly where I needed to go next and what I needed to do once I got there. To say that was incredibly tedious is an understatement, and I am honestly amazed I was able to put up with the game as long as I was in order to see if maybe things got better once I got to Act 2, and of course they didn't, so I just gave up on the game at that point. Any one of its problems in isolation is not enough to tank the entire experience, but they all compound on each other to produce a game that is so utterly bewildering in its failure that the only phrase that really encapsulates the experience of playing Graven is simply, what the fuck? And with that said, that's basically everything I've got to say about Graven. It is an absolute mess, and there is absolutely no reason you should play it unless they do some major overhauls at some point, but I very highly doubt they're going to do that. And that is just immensely frustrating, because I was actually legitimately looking forward to Graven. It was a game that was right up my alley. Dark fantasy, first-person action game. We don't get a whole lot of those. And while we did certainly get Arthurian Legends fairly recently that kind of scratched that itch, we never really got something that truly scratched that HeXen itch after HeXen 2, and Graven was poised to be that. And it just wasn't. And given how unlikely it is that the Heretic and HeXen series themselves will ever return, that just makes it all the more disappointing. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really does help out. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.